London woke this week to the sound of breaking news that no one expected. What was meant to be a celebration, the final signing of a long-awaited UK-India free trade deal, has instead become one of the gravest diplomatic crises in modern British history. At 9 a.m. Thursday, journalists gathered outside Number 10 for what aides promised would be a positive announcement. Inside, cameras were positioned, flags aligned, and briefing notes rehearsed. But as reporters checked their phones, a headline from New Delhi cut through the morning air like a siren. India accuses UK of trade betrayal. Minutes later, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi appeared live before Parliament in New Delhi. His voice was measured, his words deliberate, but his message carried thunder. Britain has not acted as a partner, he said. It has acted as a deceiver. Within seconds, the story leapt across continents. In Westminster, disbelief turned to silence. In the City of London, traders froze before screens flashing red. And for the first time since Brexit, Britain found itself publicly accused of economic manipulation by one of its closest allies. Behind the scenes, officials scrambled to understand what had gone wrong. The trade pact, months in the making, had been marketed as a cornerstone of Britain's Global Partnership 21 plan, designed to open digital, agricultural, and technology markets between the two nations. Yet, according to documents released by Indian negotiators, the final draft included hidden clauses inserted late in the process that limited India's agricultural exports and granted preferential tax corridors to select British conglomerates linked to ruling party donors. Downing Street denied wrongdoing, claiming technical miscommunication. But in diplomatic language, miscommunication often means mistrust, and that, more than any line of text, was what shattered the alliance. Across London, the familiar hum of daily politics gave way to emergency briefings. Labour backbenchers demanded explanations. Opposition leaders called for an inquiry, and as the story grew, one uncomfortable truth emerged: someone inside the British government had authorized the changes without informing India's trade delegation. In New Delhi, the mood was far from bureaucratic. It was electric. Before a packed chamber, Prime Minister Modi raised his hand toward the cameras and declared, "The Commonwealth is not a crown to be worn. It is a trust to be honored." The applause was deafening not just in India's parliament, but in living rooms across the subcontinent. For many Indians, this was not merely a trade dispute. It was history reversing its course. Outside the British High Commission in Chanakyapuri, protesters waved placards reading "No more betrayal" and "Trade with truth." Television anchors described it as the Suez moment of the 21st century. Within hours, the Indian rupee strengthened slightly while the British pound slipped, a symbolic reversal that made global headlines. The crisis deepened when India's foreign ministry recalled its London envoy for consultations. Behind that diplomatic phrasing lay a rupture unseen since the late 1940s. Across Commonwealth capitals, phones rang non-stop. Ottawa asked for clarification. Canberra urged restraint. Pretoria called for mediation. And yet, as tempers flared abroad, silence filled Buckingham Palace. King Charles, known for his quiet diplomacy, requested full intelligence briefings from both the Foreign Office and the High Commission. Palace sources described him as concerned and disappointed. The British public, meanwhile, watched in confusion. For months, they had heard promises of a new special partnership with India, a bridge between post-Brexit Britain and the world's fastest-growing democracy. Now, that bridge seemed on fire. At Westminster, the tone grew defensive. Prime Minister Starmer, usually measured and cautious, appeared under siege. Opposition leaders accused him of arrogance, of treating allies as subordinates. Even members of his own cabinet whispered that Downing Street had misjudged Modi's resolve. By evening, the story had overtaken every bulletin. The BBC's lead segment opened with 4 words: "A friendship in flames." Friday morning brought no calm. When the Prime Minister arrived at Buckingham Palace for his routine audience, cameras captured what should have been an ordinary handshake. But analysts noticed what wasn't there: the usual smiles. Behind closed doors, witnesses later described the conversation as firm, direct, and historic. The king reportedly told Starmer that The Commonwealth is not a commodity. A reminder, royal aides said that Britain's moral authority depends not on power, but on principle. For the palace, the breakdown of trust with India was more than a diplomatic error, it was a blow to the entire structure of post-imperial identity. For decades, the monarch had served as a symbol of unity among equals. Now, one political misstep threatened to unravel that fabric. Inside Parliament, murmurs turned to movement. Backbench Labour MPs began drafting letters of concern. A quiet rebellion brewed not over ideology, but over integrity. One MP put it bluntly, if we cannot keep faith with Delhi, how can we expect Ottawa or Nairobi to trust us? News of that unrest reached foreign capitals within hours. In Ottawa, the Canadian Prime Minister called an emergency cabinet meeting. In Canberra, journalists spoke of a Commonwealth in crisis, and in New Delhi, the message was unmistakable. India would not return to the table until Britain acknowledged wrongdoing. The king, constitutionally bound to neutrality, faced a delicate line. Publicly, he remained silent. Privately, he was active, speaking with Commonwealth leaders, urging patience and reminding them that institutions outlast governments. It was a masterclass in quiet diplomacy, and yet its very existence underscored the fragility of the moment. By the weekend, the shockwaves had reached the financial world. Sterling continued to slip. London's stock exchange saw its steepest single-day decline since the mini-budget of 2022. Analysts called it the Modi effect. In Mumbai, investors spoke of opportunity that India's assertiveness signaled a new global balance. In Washington, officials expressed concern, carefully avoiding the word crisis. And in Beijing, state media smiled silently, framing the saga as proof of Western hypocrisy. Yet beyond the headlines lay a human story. In Birmingham, Leicester, and Southall cities woven with threads of Indian heritage, community leaders pleaded for calm. Small business owners, many dependent on Indo-British trade, faced uncertainty. We don't want politics, one grocer said on camera. We want partnership. Meanwhile, inside Number 10, fatigue was setting in. Advisors described the Prime Minister as distant, sleepless, determined to survive. Leaks suggested that cabinet members had begun contacting senior diplomats independently, bypassing Downing Street in search of damage control, and then, as if scripted for drama, came another revelation. A leaked email from a senior advisor described Indian negotiators as too emotional to grasp Western complexities. The phrasing, when published by The Guardian, detonated like political dynamite. Protesters gathered outside Parliament within hours. The phrase, too emotional, became a rallying cry chanted in London, tweeted from Delhi, and dissected on every network talk show from CNN International to NDTV. By Sunday, Britain's image abroad was in free fall. Former diplomats called it the greatest foreign policy humiliation since Suez, and for once, few disagreed. Monday dawned gray over Westminster, the kind of gray that carries both rain and reckoning. The morning papers were brutal. Trade of Deceit, The Times. Star, Mirror in Crisis. The Telegraph. Commonwealth at the brink, The Guardian. Inside the palace, courtiers confirmed that King Charles had held midnight consultations with senior advisors. The discussion, whether to deliver a rare public address on the importance of trust among nations. At noon, the bells of Westminster Abbey rang for a scheduled remembrance service, yet outside, the crowd gathered not in mourning, but in protest. Placards read, Truth before trade. Chants echoed through Whitehall, apologize or resign. When the Prime Minister finally appeared before cameras that evening, the setting was somber, flanked by two flags. He spoke with deliberate calm. Our partnership with India remains vital. Misunderstandings have occurred and we will address them. But the words fell flat. There was no apology, no admission, no empathy. Across the screen, analysts noted the absence of sincerity. Moments later, Indian Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar held his own briefing in Delhi. Britain must decide whether it seeks partnership or dominance. The world will judge by actions, not statements. The contrast was striking, one leader defensive, the other decisive. In the days that followed, Britain's political scene fractured further. Cabinet resignations loomed. Opposition parties drafted a motion of censure. Through it all, the monarch's silence carried the loudest weight. Finally, on the seventh day of crisis, Buckingham Palace issued a carefully worded statement. His Majesty remains committed to the values of mutual respect and honesty which bind the Commonwealth together. It was short, but everyone understood its meaning. In polite constitutional language, it was a rebuke, one that history will not forget. In New Delhi, parliamentarians stood and applauded their Prime Minister. In London, Lawmakers sat in uneasy silence. The question now was no longer about a trade deal, but about trust between governments, between people and between past and future. As markets stabilized and statements softened, analysts began to see the outlines of a deeper shift. The era of quiet British authority within the Commonwealth had ended. In its place stood a new reality, one in which former colonies spoke as equals, and Britain at last had to listen. For historians, the irony was profound. The very institution once built to project influence was now teaching Britain humility, and as the rain returned over Westminster Bridge, one could almost hear the echo of that lesson in every drop that fell. Weeks later, a BBC correspondent closed his nightly broadcast with words that captured the nation's mood. From London to Delhi, this was more than a trade dispute. It was a test of integrity, of respect, and of the future Britain wishes to build. In the calm that followed, diplomats returned to their work, markets recovered, and headlines moved on. Yet something fundamental had changed not on paper, but in perception. Because when trust breaks between allies, treaties can be rewritten, but reputations cannot. And so the story ends where it began. Two nations bound by history, divided by pride, and reminded in the glare of a global audience that the true measure of power is not control, but credibility.